Shooters, the name of the book that I wrote about being a cameraman for 40 years working for television. I went all around the world. I had some fascinating experience. Some were a little frightening and some were marvellous. And I met some incredible people. It was always an adventure being a cameraman. I'd be sitting in a theatre or having lunch or dinner with my wife, and my beeper would go off, and half an hour later I'd be on a plane flying to somewhere abroad, or the biggest story in the world, or some big celebration that was happening just then. I did it for 40 years and I never got bored. I think it was just as exciting when I finished as when I began. I met some really interesting people. I met Frank Sinatra, Charlton Heston, Rex Harrison. Some of them were lovely and others were hard to get on with. But I guess any job's like that. Have you ever stayed at Claridge's, Bob? What, me? I laughed. That's for millionaires and film stars. The small Irish man asking me the question was the flight engineer of the gun-running plane that we would travel into the Biafran War with. I did, he said. I'd been gun-running in Indonesia and the Far East for quite a while, and I had lots of money, and I decided I needed a holiday. So I took a plane to London, got a cab, and told them to take me to Claridge's. I was dressed horribly. He said I had a beat-up old t-shirt and a rotten old pair of jeans covered in oil. And when the door of the cab opened, the doorman at Claridge's came forward quickly. I think he wanted me to go round to the servants' entrance. Anyway, I quickly reached into my shoulder bag and gave him £100 tip. That changed everything. He said, you know, I had £84,000 in that shoulder bag. He said, so I went inside and gave £100 tip to the head porter, and £100 tip to the concierge, and then he looked nostalgic and he said, you know, they treat you like a king at that hotel, Bob. And I laughed and I said, I bet they do. You should give them £100 tips. I'd flown to Libya to film Ed Wilson. Ed Wilson was a notorious CIA defector, and he was wanted in the States. He'd been supplying Gaddafi with explosives, making millions of dollars, helping train the Libyan army with some of his special forces friends. And he was dark, sinister, and very dangerous looking. He looked at me as I set up my lights. I don't want to be recognized in this film, he said. And I said, oh yeah. And he said, you know you live in London, Bob. And he said, if I can be recognized in this film, I'll come to London and get you. You know, I filmed him in deep shadow, talking to our reporter, and there wasn't a trace of recognizable image of him when the film appeared on the screen. Anyway, he got lured back to the States, and he was put on trial, and he was sent to jail for 42 years. So I guess I'm all right. I once sat in a blackened van in New York with their anti-mugging squad, hoping to film a mugger in action. We did. The poor guy must have got the fright of his life when the doors of the van suddenly opened. I jumped out with my camera light blazing, and he was surrounded by detectives with guns rammed against his head. I think he got off later though, because they called it entrapment. I spent 4 weeks with Martin Luther King in Atlanta, hearing him preach, and then went with him to the United Nations in New York, and then flew to London with him, where he preached in St. Paul's, and then went to Oslo with him, where he got the Nobel Peace Prize. Martin Luther King was an easy subject to film. He was late for every appointment he made, and so we had plenty of time to get ready. And he was also a very nice man to work with. I've been filming in New York at the New York Beggar School, where people were taught the best way to beg. And I seen the dear old lady talking to the instructor. And we were out in the street watching them the next day. And she walked up to the bus stop where a line-up of businessmen were waiting to get a bus to go to Wall Street. "Excuse me, sir," she said, picking on one of the youngest. "May I sketch you?" And before he had a moment to refuse, she smiled at him. She said, "You have such an interesting face," and she started to draw him. She was awful. Every pencil stroke she made the picture worse. And he grew more and more embarrassed as the line-up around him grinned. And then she stopped for a second and she said, "You know, sir, lots of people give me $10 to help out with my materials." So he took out his wallet and gave her a $10 bill, and she thanked him prettily. And then the bus came along, much to his relief. And he tried to get on, and she grabbed him. She said, "No, no, don't go. I haven't finished." She said, "Get the next bus." And he said, "No, I've got to go." He said, "I'm going to be late for work." And he tore himself out of her grasp and jumped on the bus. And she grinned and tore up the sketch and waited for her next victim. A kind of a job that lots of people wouldn't like to do, but I found it absolutely fascinating. And I think you might find this book that I wrote interesting enough to read. So take a look at Shooter.